Hello, it's great to have you here. If you enjoy thrilling romances, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories. The sky over Wyoming was the color of a fresh bruise, a sullen purple-gray that promised more rain the land didn't need. Cornelius guided his steady buckskin Apollo along the jagged new scar on the landscape. The rockslide had come in the night, a thunderous roar that had shaken the very bones of his small ranch house. He'd spent the better part of the morning ensuring his cattle hadn't been spooked through the fences, and now he was surveying the true extent of the damage to his southern boundary. He was a man carved from the same stubborn rock that now lay shattered across the trail. 40 years had etched themselves into the corners of his eyes and mouth, and the loss of his wife, Margaret, 5 years prior, had chiseled the rest of him into something hard and solitary. His world had shrunk to the rhythm of the seasons, the needs of his herd, and the vast aching silence of his home. It was Apollo who sensed her first, his ears swiveling forward, a low nicker rumbling in his chest. Cornelius pulled back on the reins, his gaze sweeping the chaotic jumble of shale and granite. He saw nothing but devastation. "Easy, boy," he murmured, his voice a low gravel, rough from disuse. "Just rocks and ruin." But the horse persisted, taking a hesitant step forward and sniffing the air. Cornelius's hand went instinctively to the Winchester resting in its scabbard. Trouble in these parts rarely announced itself with a polite knock. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and moved with a quiet purpose that belied his size. And then he saw it, a splash of dark color against the pale gray of the stone, nearly indistinguishable from a shadow. It was a mass of long black hair, fanned out like spilled ink. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a woman, lying half-pinned beneath a slab of rock that had, by some miracle, been stopped by a sturdy pinyon pine before it could crush her entirely. He knelt, his movements swift and economical. She was native, that much was clear from the high, proud cheekbones and the intricate beadwork on the tattered remains of her buckskin dress. She was unconscious, her face pale and streaked with dirt, a nasty gash bleeding sluggishly at her temple. Her breathing was shallow, a fragile flutter in the vast, indifferent landscape. For a moment, he hesitated. A Ute, or a Shoshone woman, so far from the reservation lands, could mean a dozen different kinds of trouble. She could have family nearby, who wouldn't take kindly to a white man finding her. She could be a decoy. His life had taught him that caution was a better companion than compassion. He thought of the empty chair at his dinner table, the cold side of his bed, the silence that was his only answer. What was one more complication in a life already defined by what was missing? But then he saw the delicate line of her jaw, the way her lashes rested against her cheek like tiny, dark feathers. She wasn't a threat. She was just a person, broken and alone, at the mercy of the wild. The memory of Margaret, her face pale in her final hours, flashed through his mind. He couldn't leave her. His code, the unwritten law of a decent man, wouldn't allow it. With a grunt, he put his shoulder to the rock, his muscles straining against the immense weight. It shifted just an inch, then another. He worked the stone back and forth until he had enough space to gently pull her free. She was lighter than he expected, a bird-boned thing. He scooped her into his arms, her head lolling against his chest, and was struck by a strange protective urge he hadn't felt in years. The ride back to the ranch was slow and deliberate. He held her securely in front of him, her body a warm, limp weight against his. He could feel the faint, unsteady beat of her heart, a counterpoint to the steady rhythm of Apollo's gait. He tried not to notice the scent of pine needles and damp earth that clung to her hair, a scent that was wild and untamed and achingly alive. Inside the quiet solitude of his house, he laid her gently on his own bed. The place had been meticulously clean, but devoid of comfort for years. Now this stranger's presence seemed to fill the room, to challenge its emptiness. He lit a lamp, the golden light washing over her still form, and went to work. He fetched the wooden box that held his medical supplies, carbolic soap, clean rags, and a bottle of whiskey that served as both antiseptic and anesthetic. He began with the gash on her temple, his large, calloused hands moving with a surprising gentleness as he cleaned away the blood and dirt. She stirred under his touch, a soft moan escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. He worked his way down, finding a series of cuts and bruises on her arms and torso. Her dress was torn in several places, the tough hide rent as if by a giant's claws. He did his best to clean the wounds without disturbing her too much, his focus absolute. This was a task, like mending a fence or birthing a calf, a problem to be solved. He refused to let himself think of her as anything more than that, but as he tended to a deep scrape on her shin, he saw that the buckskin dress was torn high up on her thigh, the fabric bunched up around another, more serious-looking injury. The skin around it was already beginning to swell and discolor. If it got infected, she could lose the leg or her life. He knew he had to clean it properly. She began to stir again, her eyelids fluttering. Dark eyes, the color of wet river stones, blinked open, clouded with confusion and pain. They fixed on his face, wide and wary. She tried to sit up, a flash of panic in her gaze, but a sharp intake of breath told him the movement had sent a jolt of agony through her. "Easy now," Cornelius said, his voice softer than he intended. "Easy. You're safe here. You took a bad fall." She said nothing, her eyes tracking his every move as he dipped a fresh cloth into the basin of warm water. She didn't understand his words, or perhaps she simply didn't trust them. He could see the fear warring with a fierce, deep-seated pride. She was a cornered animal, uncertain if he was her savior or her captor. He gestured toward her leg. "This needs cleaning," he explained simply, pointing to the swollen area. "Bad cut." Her gaze followed his, and a new tension entered her body. She understood. He saw the flicker of vulnerability, the shame of being so exposed and helpless before a stranger. She gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, her jaw tight. Cornelius took it as permission. He held the damp cloth, his mind focused on the task. He had to see the extent of the wound beneath the torn fabric. "I need to look," he said, more to himself than to her. "Tell me if it hurts." Then, wanting to be more direct, he rephrased, "Does it hurt here?" His voice was low, a question of simple care. He gently, carefully, slid his hand beneath the rough, torn edge of her buckskin dress, his fingers brushing against the skin of her thigh. He was expecting the warmth of her skin, the slickness of blood from the fresh wound. He found something else entirely. Beneath his fingertips, running from her hip halfway to her knee, was a scar. It was not the puckered, messy line of an accidental injury. This was a ridge of toughened, raised flesh, long and straight and ancient. It was a deliberate mark, a brand of violence from a past she carried hidden under her clothes. It felt like a line of hardened history, a story written on her skin with a blade. The contact, the unexpected discovery, sent a jolt through him. But the change in her was far more electric. The moment his fingers traced that old wound, her entire look transformed. The vulnerability in her eyes vanished, extinguished as if by a sudden gale. The fear was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a silent, cold ferocity. Her eyes narrowed, becoming sharp and focused, glittering in the lamplight with a hardened, wary intelligence. Her body went rigid beneath his hand, no longer a helpless victim, but a warrior, assessing a threat. She did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply stared at him, her gaze locking onto his. And in that single, chilling moment, Cornelius knew. The rockslide hadn't been an accident, and the woman lying in his bed was no mere traveler lost in a storm. She was a secret, wrapped in a mystery, and he had just stumbled upon the key. The charged silence in the room stretched thin, as taut as a bowstring. Cornelius slowly withdrew his hand, the ghost of that hardened scar still imprinted on his fingertips. He looked from her fierce, unblinking eyes back to the raw, new wound on her leg. The world had just shifted on its axis, but the immediate need remained. A wound was a wound, and it would not wait for answers. Without a word, he picked up the clean cloth again. He met her gaze, his own steady and unreadable, and gave a slow, deliberate nod toward her leg. It was not a command, but a statement of intent. "I am going to finish this." He was offering her a choice, to trust him for one more moment, or to fight. She watched him, her chest rising and falling with tightly controlled breaths. The fire in her eyes didn't die, but it banked, receding into watchful embers. She held his gaze for a long count of 3, then lowered her chin in a sharp, almost imperceptible dip. Permission. His touch was different this time. He was painstakingly careful to clean only the new injury, his fingers avoiding the old scar, as if it were a sacred line he had no right to cross. He worked with a focused efficiency that was its own form of respect. He was a rancher, a man who understood that some animals were too proud to show pain, and that the greatest kindness was a swift, competent hand that didn't linger on their weakness. When he was done, he applied a salve of his own making, yarrow and comfrey steeped in pine pitch, and bound the wound with clean strips of linen. The following days settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm. He named her Mourning Dove in his mind, for the way the early light seemed to catch the quiet strength in her features when she thought he wasn't looking. She never offered her real name, and he never asked. He would leave a tray of food, simple broth, then stew and hardtack, on the small table by the bed, and retreat to the other side of the room, or outside to his chores. He gave her the privacy of his bedroom, taking for himself a bedroll by the hearth in the main room. It was a clear, unspoken boundary. He was her caretaker, not her captor. Morning Dove, for her part, was a silent observer. As her strength returned, she would sit up in the bed, a wool blanket pulled around her shoulders, and watch him. She watched the way he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a life of hard work. She saw the photograph on the mantelpiece of a smiling, fair-haired woman and understood the source of the deep-seated loneliness in his eyes. She listened to the low, gentle murmur of his voice as he spoke to his horse and his dog, a softness he never used with her. She was assessing him, weighing his every action against the violent benchmark she carried on her own skin. Slowly, the tension in the house began to change. It was no longer the sharp, brittle fear of a trapped animal, but a quiet, humming awareness, a fragile truce. One afternoon he came in from the rain, soaked to the bone, and found she had hobbled from the bed to add a log to the fire. Their eyes met across the room, and for the first time the fierce guard in hers was replaced by something softer, a flicker of acknowledgement. It was the closest they had come to a conversation. The truce was shattered on the 5th day. The sound of an approaching rider sent a jolt through the quiet homestead. Cornelius was outside, splitting firewood, and he straightened up, axe in hand, his face grim. He rarely had visitors, and unexpected ones were seldom welcome. Morning Dove, who had been sitting on the porch step, her injured leg propped up, went instantly still. Her hand instinctively moved to her thigh, a gesture Cornelius was beginning to recognize. The rider who came into view was the opposite of Cornelius in every way. He sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his clothes tailored and clean, his face smooth-shaven beneath a crisp black hat. This was Clifton, a man who bought land not to work it but to own it, to bleed it dry for whatever minerals lay beneath. He and Cornelius had a long-standing and deeply uncivil rivalry over a shared creek, a rivalry Clifton seemed to enjoy far more than Cornelius did. "Cornelius!" Clifton called out, his voice a rich baritone that dripped with false bonhomie. He swung down from his horse with an easy grace. "Just the man I wanted to see. Heard the mountain came down on your southern pasture. Came to see if you needed a hand." "I manage my own affairs, Clifton," Cornelius said flatly, not moving from his spot. Clifton's smile didn't falter, but his eyes, small and dark like a crow's, were cold. They swept the property, taking in the small house, the sturdy barn, the man standing before him, and then they landed on Morning Dove. The change in her was instantaneous and violent. All the color drained from her face, leaving her skin a taut, ashen mask. Her eyes, fixed on Clifton, widened with a mixture of pure, undiluted hatred and a deep, primal fear. A low sound, almost a hiss, escaped her lips, and her entire body trembled, as if she were fighting the urge to either run or attack. Clifton's gaze lingered on her for a moment, a flicker of something, recognition, curiosity, in their depths. He dismissed her just as quickly, turning his attention back to Cornelius with a smug smirk. "Seems you've found yourself some company. Getting lonely out here, old man? What do you want?" Cornelius asked, his voice dangerously low. He had seen her reaction, and a cold knot of dread formed in his gut. "Just a neighborly chat," Clifton said, his smile widening. He launched into a veiled offer, dressing up a threat as a business proposition, suggesting Cornelius was spread too thin and might be better off selling the parcel of land bordering the creek. It was the same dance they had done a dozen times. Cornelius shut him down, his answers short and sharp. He wanted the man gone. He could feel Morning Dove's terror radiating from the porch like a physical heat. Every moment Clifton stayed was like pressing a hot coal against her skin. Finally, with a theatrical sigh and a promise to check in again soon, Clifton mounted his stallion and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Cornelius waited until the rider was a small speck in the distance before he turned. He walked to the porch and stood before Morning Dove. She was still frozen, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the wooden step. She was staring at the spot where Clifton had disappeared, her breathing ragged. "You know him," Cornelius stated. It wasn't a question, she didn't answer. She couldn't seem to tear her eyes away from the horizon. "Morning Dove," he said, using the name he had given her for the first time aloud. Her head snapped toward him, her eyes wild. He knelt in front of her, forcing her to look at him. "Who is he?" Her lips trembled, and for a moment he thought she would shatter. But then the warrior returned. She straightened her back, and the fear in her eyes was consumed by a burning, righteous anger that seemed to come from the very core of her being. "He is the man who carries the devil's shadow," she said, her voice raspy but clear, the first full sentence she had spoken to him. "He is the butcher who came to my village when the moon was new." Cornelius felt the world contract to the space between them. He waited, knowing he had to let the story come on its own terms. "He was not looking for land, then," she continued, her hand tracing the air over her scarred leg. "He was looking for a stone, the Iyoyampa Wakan, the stone that sings to the spirits, a sacred relic of my people." Her eyes became distant, lost in a memory of smoke and screams. "He and his men burned our lodges, they hurt our people. They demanded we give it to them." She finally met his gaze, and the pain in her eyes was a raw, physical thing. "I was young. I tried to stop him from hurting my mother." He laughed. Her voice broke, but she forced it steady. "He held me down. He took his knife and told me that every time I looked at my own body, I would remember the price of defiance." She took a shaky breath, the story pouring out of her now that the dam had broken. "They did not find the stone. Our elders had hidden it, but he vowed he would return. I have spent 5 years tracking him, learning his ways, watching his movements. I followed him here. I was watching his men surveying near the mountain when the rocks fell. The truth landed between them, heavy and terrible. She wasn't an accident. She was a sentinel, a guardian on a sacred mission. The scar wasn't just a mark of past violence. It was a map, a reminder, the entire reason she was here. And her sworn enemy, the monster from her past, was his neighbor, a man who wanted to steal his water. Cornelius looked at the woman before him, no longer seeing a helpless victim he had rescued from the rocks. He saw a survivor, a warrior whose quiet presence in his house was not a burden, but a testament to a will stronger than any stone. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that her fight had just become his. Folks, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Write your city and state in the comments so I can give you a shout-out. The confession hung in the air, dense and irrevocable. Clifton was no longer just a greedy neighbor. He was a monster wearing a familiar face. Cornelius looked at Morning Dove, at the fierce resolve that had replaced her fear, and felt the foundations of his solitary life crack wide open. For 5 years, he had been tending to the past, nursing the quiet grief of his own loss. Now a living, breathing battle had been laid at his doorstep, and a woman's honor was tied to its outcome. "The stone," Cornelius said, his voice a low rumble. "Where is it now?" "Safe," she replied, her gaze sharp. "Hidden in a place the earth keeps secret. But Clifton is like a coyote. He is patient and circles what he wants. His men were not just surveying for a new trail, they were searching for the entrance to the old caves in the foothills. He senses it is near." Cornelius rose to his feet and paced the length of the porch, his mind racing. He could tell her to leave. He could take her to the nearest town, put her on a stagecoach, and wash his hands of the entire affair. It would be the safe thing to do, the logical choice for a man who wanted nothing more than a quiet life. Clifton was powerful, with deep pockets and men on his payroll who didn't ask questions. To stand against him was to invite a war he wasn't prepared to fight. But then he looked at her. He saw the way she held herself, her injured leg a testament to her sacrifice, her spirit unbent despite the horrors she had endured. To turn her away now would be a betrayal not just of her, but of the man Margaret had loved, the man he was supposed to be. His honor, a rusty and neglected thing, demanded he act. "He won't find it," Cornelius said, his decision made. The words felt solid, real, as he spoke them. "Because we are going to move it first." Morning Dove's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise cutting through her hardened resolve. She had expected disbelief, perhaps pity, or even a demand for her to leave. She had not expected an immediate, unquestioning alliance. You can't do this alone," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You know the land, the signs, the way to this place. I know Clifton. I know how he thinks, and I have the resources to get you there and back before he even knows we're gone. You need a horse, supplies, and someone to watch your back." For the first time since he'd met her, Morning Dove looked uncertain. Trust was a currency her life had taught her was worthless. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "This is not your fight." Cornelius stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. His gaze was direct, stripped of all pretense. "Her man who scars a child for sport is every decent person's fight, and he wants my water. That makes it my business." He offered her both the noble truth and a practical one, giving her pride a foothold. A silent understanding passed between them. It was a pact, sealed not with a handshake but with a shared look of grim determination. The fragile truce had been reforged into a partnership, as strong and unyielding as iron. They spent the next day preparing. Their movements were a dance of quiet efficiency. While Cornelius packed saddlebags with dried rations, ammunition, and medical supplies, Mourning Dove sketched a rough map in the dirt with a stick. Her knowledge of the terrain was intimate, learned not from paper but from seasons of walking it, listening to it, and understanding its secrets. She pointed out ridges that offered cover, streams that ran clean, and canyons that could become traps. Cornelius brought out his gentlest mare, a steady-minded bay named Daisy. He watched as Mourning Dove, her legs still tender, approached the horse not with dominance, but with a quiet respect. She murmured to the animal in her own language, her voice a soft, melodic song, and rested her forehead against the mare's for a long moment. Daisy, who was often skittish with strangers, stood perfectly still, nuzzling her hand. In that moment, Cornelius saw the deep connection she had with the world, a harmony he had only ever felt with his land, never with its creatures in such a profound way. They set out before dawn 2 days later, under a blanket of stars that was beginning to fade to indigo. The air was crisp and cold, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. They rode in silence, Cornelius in the lead on Apollo, his Winchester resting comfortably across his lap, and Mourning Dove following on Daisy, her back straight, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The journey was a crucible that melted away the last of their reservations. He saw her strength, the way she ignored the pain in her leg, the way she read the landscape like a book, pointing out the subtle track of a deer or the distant call of a hawk. She saw his steadfastness, the way he cared for the horses before himself, the quiet competence with which he made camp, the unwavering watchfulness in his eyes as he took the first watch each night. On the second night, they were camped in a small, sheltered cove, the fire a tiny flicker of warmth against the vast darkness. The howl of a distant wolf echoed through the canyons. "You are not afraid," Mourning Dove observed, her voice soft in the firelight. "I respect them," Cornelius answered, staring into the flames. "Fear is a waste of energy. My wife, Margaret, she was afraid of them. Used to say they sounded like ghosts crying for what they'd lost." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife's name to her. The word hung in the air between them, a small, vulnerable offering. "To my people, the wolf is a teacher," Mourning Dove said quietly. "A brother. He teaches loyalty, strength, and how to survive. He does not cry for what is lost. He sings to his family, to let them know where he is." Cornelius looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the warrior, but the woman. The firelight softened the hard lines of her face, illuminating a deep well of wisdom in her eyes. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer empty, but filled with a shared understanding, a quiet companionship that warmed him more than the fire. He was beginning to realize that the silence in his home hadn't just been the absence of his wife. It had been the absence of a connection, a bond he thought he would never feel again. The next day, they found tracks. 2 riders, shod horses, heading in the same general direction. Clifton's men. "They are clumsy," Mourning Dove said, dismounting to examine the prints. "They make too much noise, but they are moving fast." Clifton must have found something that made him impatient. The sense of urgency sharpened. They pushed the horses harder, leaving the main trails and following ancient game paths that Mourning Dove seemed to know by heart. The terrain grew rougher, the mountains looming over them like stone giants. Finally, as the sun began to dip below the western peaks, she stopped. "We are here," she said, her voice hushed with reverence. They were at the base of a sheer cliff face, a chaotic jumble of fallen boulders and ancient twisted junipers at its feet. There was no discernible opening, no sign of a cave. "The entrance is hidden," she explained. "It only reveals itself when the last light of the sun touches the raven's eye." She pointed to a peculiar rock formation high above them that from a certain angle looked like the head of a bird. They waited. As the sun sank, a single brilliant beam of golden light lanced through a notch in the opposing ridge and struck the cliff face. For a fleeting moment, it illuminated a dark vertical fissure behind a curtain of rock face vines, an opening no wider than a man's shoulders. Just as they were about to move, the sound of dislodged pebbles from above reached them. Cornelius reacted instantly, pulling Morning Dove and the horses back into the deep shadows of an overhang. Two men appeared on the ridge above, silhouetted against the dying light. Clifton's men. They hadn't found the entrance, but they were close. Dangerously close. Cornelius and Morning Dove exchanged a look. There was no time to wait for the men to leave. The light was fading fast, and with it their chance to find the entrance. They had to get to the relic now. With the men still scanning the area from above, Cornelius made a silent gesture. "We go." He moved first, a shadow hugging the base of the cliff. Morning Dove followed, her movements swift and silent despite her injury. They reached the hidden fissure just as the last ray of sunlight vanished, plunging the cliff into deep shadow. They slipped inside, leaving the horses tethered in the relative safety of the alcove. The air inside was cool and smelled of stone and stillness. It was a narrow passage that soon opened into a vast, dark cavern. The final battle for the stone, for her past and their future, was about to begin, and they were no longer alone. From the darkness ahead, they heard the unmistakable sound of a boot scraping on stone. Clifton, impatient as ever, had found another way in. The darkness inside the cavern was absolute, a thick living presence that swallowed sound and light. It was a stillness Cornelius had never known, broken only by the drip of unseen water and the ragged sound of his own breath. Morning Dove's hand found his arm, her touch a steadying anchor in the void. She guided him forward, her steps sure-footed and silent on the uneven stone floor, navigating the labyrinth from a map etched in the memory of her ancestors. Ahead, a faint, flickering orange light danced against the cavern walls, casting long, monstrous shadows. With it came the sound of Clifton's voice, echoing with impatience. "Find it. It has to be in this main chamber. Spread out and check every cursed rock." They reached the edge of the passage and peered into the vast central grotto. It was a breathtaking sight, a natural cathedral of stone with glittering mineral veins striping the walls like ancient frescoes. In the center, on a natural altar of white calcite, sat a stone. It was no ordinary rock. It was a smooth, dark obsidian, no larger than a man's heart, and it seemed to drink the lamplight, emitting a soft, internal luminescence, a deep blue glow that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. The Iyoyampa Wakan. Clifton stood near it, his face alight with avarice, while one of his men searched the chamber's perimeter. Cornelius knew a direct confrontation was foolish. He caught Morning Dove's eye and pointed toward a narrow, dark tunnel to their left. He picked up a loose stone the size of his fist. She understood immediately. While Clifton's man had his back turned, Cornelius hurled the stone deep into the side tunnel. It clattered against the rock walls, the sound echoing unnaturally, sounding like a man stumbling in the dark. "What was that?" the henchman called out, spinning around. "Go check it out, you fool!" Clifton snarled, his eyes fixed on the glowing relic. "And be quick about it." The man hesitated, then plunged into the side tunnel, his lantern creating a bouncing, frantic light that soon disappeared around a bend. They were one gun down. Now, Cornelius and Morning Dove stepped from the shadows together. "That stone will never belong to you, Clifton," Morning Dove said, her voice ringing with a cold, clear power that silenced the dripping water. Clifton spun around, his hand flying to the pistol at his hip. His eyes widened in disbelief as he saw her, then narrowed with contemptuous recognition. Standing beside her, solid as the mountain itself, was Cornelius. "Well, I'll be," Clifton sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "The little Shoshone bird, all grown up. And with a pet rancher, no less. I should have slit your throat instead of just marking you." "You've taken enough from her people," Cornelius said, his voice a low growl. He began to move slowly to the right, drawing Clifton's attention, his body positioned to shield Morning Dove. "This ends tonight." "It does," Clifton agreed, raising his pistol. "But not for me." As he aimed, Morning Dove let out a sharp, piercing cry, a hawk's call that echoed through the vast chamber, disorienting and unnatural. For a split second, Clifton flinched, his focus broken. It was all the time Cornelius needed. He lunged, not at Clifton, but at the lantern perched on a nearby rock, kicking it over. The grotto was plunged back into near-total darkness, the only light the faint, ethereal blue glow from the sacred stone. Clifton fired, the shot a deafening explosion in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash illuminated a scene of chaos, the bullet whining off the rock wall far from its target. Cornelius used the moment of blindness to tackle Clifton, the two men crashing to the stone floor. It was a raw, brutal struggle of leverage and strength. Cornelius had the grit of a man who worked with his hands, but Clifton was wiry and desperate, fighting like a cornered snake. Meanwhile, Mourning Dove was not idle. She was not a damsel to be saved. She scrambled toward the mouth of the tunnel where the henchman had gone. Above it, a section of the ceiling was a precarious web of fractured rock, something her instincts had noted the moment she entered. Using a loose piece of shale as a lever, she began to work at the base of the largest, most unstable pillar. It was the knowledge of her people, the understanding that the mountain gives, but it can also take away. The henchman, hearing the gunshot, was running back. His light was visible, bouncing wildly in the tunnel. Below, Cornelius landed a solid punch on Clifton's jaw, dazing him. He wrestled the pistol from Clifton's grasp, tossing it skittering into the darkness. Just as the henchman burst back into the main chamber, Mourning Dove gave one final desperate heave. With a deep groan, the stone pillar gave way. A cascade of rock and earth thundered down, completely sealing the side passage. The henchman's light was extinguished, his shouts cut off by a wall of stone. He was trapped but alive. The sudden roar and the ground-shaking impact sent Clifton into a panic. He scrambled away from Cornelius, his greed momentarily forgotten in the face of the mountain's power. He saw his escape route gone, his man lost. He was alone. He made a final, desperate dash for the relic, his last remaining prize. He never made it. Cornelius's arms snaked around his throat from behind, cutting off his air. Clifton struggled for a moment, his hands clawing uselessly at the unyielding force before slumping into unconsciousness. Silence returned to the cavern, profound and complete. There was only the sound of two people breathing and the soft, steady pulse of the stone. Mourning Dove walked to the altar. She did not snatch the relic. She approached it with reverence, her hands outstretched. As she lifted the Ioyampa Wakan, its blue light intensified, casting a serene glow on her face, washing away the years of pain and anger, leaving only a deep, quiet peace. She had honored her people. She had reclaimed their spirit. They left Clifton bound securely, a gag in his mouth. An anonymous tip to the marshal in South Pass City would be enough. A wealthy land baron found tied up in a sealed cave, his hired gun trapped nearby, would be a scandal that would shatter his power far more effectively than a bullet. His reign of fear was over. The ride back was a stark contrast to the journey there. They rode side by side, the tension replaced by an easy, comfortable silence. The shared danger had burned away all uncertainty, leaving a bond forged in darkness and sealed in victory. He saw the way she would look at him when she thought he wasn't watching, her eyes full of a soft wonder that made his heart ache in a way he hadn't thought possible. They did not go directly to his ranch. Mourning Dove led him on a path he had never traveled, to a hidden valley where the smoke of cook fires rose from a small, peaceful encampment. Her people. She was welcomed with cries of joy and relief. She presented the relic to a wizened elder, whose face was a beautiful map of a long and storied life. This was Wicasa. He took the stone with trembling hands, his eyes shining with tears. He then turned his gaze to Cornelius. He looked not at the color of his skin, but into his soul, and what he saw there made him smile. "You have protected our daughter and returned our heart," Wicasa said, in surprisingly clear English. "Our home is your home. You will always be welcome here." Cornelius stayed for 2 days, a guest of honor. He saw the life Mourning Dove was fighting for, a world of community, tradition, and deep respect for the land, and he saw her choose. On the third morning, as he prepared to leave, she came to him leading Daisy. She was dressed not in the tattered buckskin he had found her in, but in a beautifully beaded doe-skin dress. Her duty was done, her past was honored. Now she was choosing her future. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon as they rode into his ranch, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold. The small house no longer looked empty. It looked like a beginning. They stood on the porch, the same spot where her confession had changed everything. He took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "Margaret," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "she would have liked you. She always said this land needed a strong heart to match its spirit." Mourning Dove leaned her head against his shoulder, her gaze fixed on the endless Wyoming sky. The scar on her leg was still there, a part of her story, but it was no longer the only part. "The pain is gone, Cornelius," she whispered, not speaking of the wound but of the memory. He looked down at her, at the brave, beautiful woman who had ridden into his life on a tide of rock and ruin, and had shown him that his world did not have to be small and silent. He had healed her wounds, and she, in turn, had healed his soul. Their love, a bridge between two worlds, was the new dawn they would face together. True courage isn't found in isolation, but in the willingness to fight for another's honor. The deepest scars are not always visible, and the most profound healing begins when we build bridges of trust and compassion over the divides that separate us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to confirm your subscription and leave a like. It helps us a lot.